It is a minute before 2 o'clock. I am your moderator for today's meeting, past President Reggie Nolido. We have a very interesting talk today, and we are going to discuss something that's very important in relation to our competitiveness as an investment destination. And therefore, we hope that everyone here would have a significant time to be able to learn new things about the corporate recovery and tax incentives for enterprises or the CREATE Act. As such, we'd now like to call on our President Peter Manzano, to please call this meeting to order.
Thank you, PP Reggie. Good afternoon, fellow Rotarians, our lovely aunts and guests. I now call this 30th regular meeting of the Rotary Club of Makati to order.
Our next part of the program is the introduction of our guest speaker. We'd like to call on Rotarian George Barcelon to please introduce her for today's meeting. Thank you.
Thank you, Reggie. It gives me great pleasure to introduce our guest speaker for today, Maria Teresa S. Habitan. She is the Assistant Secretary for the Department of Finance, and as of now, Group Head for the Domestic Finance Group. She graduated from University of the Philippines as a National State Scholar, majoring in BS Economics. Afterwards, she obtained her Master's in Development Studies in the Institute of Social Studies in Hague, Netherlands. And with her educational background, she was snatched to work in the Department of Finance from the very beginning. Her present position now, as I mentioned earlier, the Assistant and Chief of the Head of the Domestic Finance Group. But over the years, she has performed in different capacity: the OIC Assistant Secretary, Strategic Economic and Research Group, Department of Finance. She was Assistant Secretary, Corporate Affairs Group, also of Department of Finance. She was a consultant for the Synergies Foundation, and she's presently the focal person for PHEITI Chair, the Multi-Stakeholders Group, and still part of the committee and board members of the International Board, Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative. She's an alternate chair and focal person for Philippines Extractive Industries Transparency Multi-Stakeholders Group, an alternate member of Philippine Deposit Insurance Corporation Board, an active member of Executive Technical Board Development Budget Coordination Committee. And we're very happy to have her as our speaker today. The breadth and depth of her understanding of our economic landscape. I'd just like to end with the parting words from her. This quote was given during the Open Government and Participatory Governance Regional Dialogue, in which, I quote, she said, "We are at the critical juncture today. The easier path is to continue with existing policies that might bring high growth temporarily, but also ensure high poverty and economic exclusion. The more challenging path, the more difficult one, is to reform the fiscal and economic policies of our country so that growth happens with equity." With that, I introduce our guest speaker, ASEC, Maria Teresa Habitan. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. George Barcelon, for that kind introduction, and also for inviting me to provide the Rotary Club of Makati and Rotary West Makati this briefing on CREATE. May I ask if somebody will share the presentation? Okay, thank you. This is a reform which is 25 years in the making and which was signed into law by the President on March 26, 2021. Before we delve into the details of CREATE, allow me to begin with a few key messages to help us to understand the rationale and the goals behind the reform. Next slide, please. CREATE has transformed. Next slide, please. Not just a tax reform bill, it is also now an economic recovery bill amid the COVID pandemic. CREATE will provide much needed relief for medium and small scale industries and enterprises through a reduction in the corporate income tax rate and end investor uncertainty by culminating the years-long discussion and debate on the rationalization of incentives for businesses. The passage of CREATE strongly projects that the Philippines is back in the game when it comes to attracting investments. With CREATE, the economy will adapt and grow as more quality jobs will be preserved or created while having little to no inflationary effect. CREATE will also help mitigate the effects of the COVID-19 pandemic and improve the quality of lives of millions of Filipinos through various tax relief measures, which I will discuss later. Next slide, please. CREATE is the largest fiscal stimulus for firms in our recent history by providing 1 trillion pesos worth of tax relief over the next 10 years. CREATE introduces an enhanced incentives package that is performance-based, time-bound, targeted, and transparent, and expands the role of the Fiscal Incentives Review Board, or FIRB, an existing government body, to improve the governance of incentives. I am sure that these principles are not new to those of you who are here, as you have been strong partners of the government in this reform. Through numerous briefings held over the past years, we have shown how this reform has evolved while maintaining the principles of a good corporate income tax reform. Next slide. We would like to take this chance to thank these organizations, which I'm sure some of you are also members, that supported this reform and clamored for its passage. Their support, your support, sent a strong signal to our legislators and allowed for us its urgent passage. CREATE is a product of strong partnerships within and outside government, and this is a win to be shared by all Filipinos. Next slide. Allow me now to share the details of the two major components of the reform. The first is the corporate income tax rate reduction, complemented by various COVID tax relief measures, making it a stimulus measure. The second is the modernization or rationalization of fiscal incentives, which addresses the governance of incentives. Next slide. From having the highest corporate income tax rate, or CIT rate, of 30%, the highest in ASEAN, CREATE reduces that immediately to 20 to 25%, which will be within the range of other ASEAN countries. Next slide. With CREATE, MSMEs registered as domestic corporations will receive the largest ever CIT rate cut in the country's recent history, with an immediate 10 percentage point reduction for businesses with total assets of not more than 100 million pesos and taxable income of 5 million pesos and below. Domestic corporations that earn a taxable income above 5 million pesos benefit from an immediate reduction of CIT rate from 30% to 25%. Foreign corporations will also pay a lowered rate of 25% CIT. For non-resident foreign corporations, the lowered rate will be enjoyed effective January 1, 2021. As temporary relief, the percentage tax rate for non-VAT taxpayers has been reduced from 3 to 1% from July 1, 2020 to June 30, 2023. The minimum corporate income tax rate has also been reduced from 2 to 1% over the same period for all corporate income taxpayers. Next slide. Proprietary, nonprofit educational institutions and hospitals also benefit significantly from the reduction from 10% to 1% of the special income tax rate for July 1, 2020, up until June 30, 2023. Regional operating headquarters, meanwhile, will continue to enjoy their 10% special rate until the end of this year, and they will be subject to the regular CIP starting next year if it does not apply for other incentives under CREATE. The special rate for ROHQs has been flagged by the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, and not repealing this special treatment could result in blacklisting of the Philippines with detrimental effects on our overseas Filipinos in their financial transactions. Foreign source dividends received by domestic corporations will now be tax exempt, subject to reinvestment of earnings in the Philippines. The improperly accumulated earnings tax, or IAET, has been repealed by CREATE. Next slide. Various tax relief measures other than income tax cuts have also been introduced with the enactment of CREATE. From January 1, 2021 to December 31, 2023, the sale and importation of capital equipment and raw materials for PPE production, all prescription drugs, medical supplies, devices, and equipment for COVID-19, and vaccines for COVID-19 are VAT exempt. Next slide. Electronic books and the sale and importation of prescription drugs on cancer, mental illness, tuberculosis, and kidney-related diseases are now also tax exempt moving forward. Next. Now we proceed to the second major component of CREATE, which is the fiscal incentives rationalization reform. Next slide. In summary, all businesses applying for tax incentives will continue to deal with investment promotion agencies or IPAs. Approval of incentives will be done by the IPAs unless the proposed project or activity exceeds an investment capital threshold of 1 billion pesos. Above this threshold, applications for incentives will be decided on by the Fiscal Incentives Review Board, an interagency cabinet-level body to oversee the grant of fiscal incentives. All IPAs and registered business enterprises, or the businesses receiving tax incentives, will be subject to the oversight of the FIRB. The FIRB is modeled after similar agencies in other countries, such as Malaysia and Singapore. The FIRB will promote transparency, accountability, good governance, and participation in the grant of tax incentives, and ensure that the Filipino people get bang for their buck in the incentives granted to businesses in exchange for jobs, technology, and value added to the economy. There will be a single list of strategic priorities for investments, called the Strategic Investment Priority Plan, or SIPP, to be defined by the Board of Investments, which is versus the current system where different IPAs have different priorities. Next slide. The special corporate income tax rate of 5% on gross income earned, or GIE, for exporters is retained under CREATE. This is the first option that exporters can avail of after their IPH. Instead of enjoying this tax perk forever, though, exporters under CREATE may only enjoy this incentive for an initial period of 10 years, which may be extended for another 10 years. However, we would like to note that this is a generous compromise, given that earlier versions of this reform proposed shorter GIE incentives periods at a higher rate. The GIE incentive is not applicable to domestic market or domestic-oriented enterprises, as this would give them undue advantage over Filipino companies that are not receiving incentives but catering to the same market. Altogether, exporters receiving incentives may enjoy tax perks for up to 17 years. Throughout the incentive period, firms will continue to enjoy VAT and duties exemptions for importation of capital equipment, spare parts, and supplies. The other option that firms can avail of after the IPH are enhanced deductions. This will be discussed in more detail in the succeeding slide, but in general, exporters may enjoy this tax perk for 10 years after their IPH, while domestic enterprises may enjoy the perks 5 years after their IPH. Next slide. Businesses receiving the enhanced deductions incentive will be subject to the prevailing corporate income tax rate, but they are allowed larger deductions as a percentage of their expenses. For example, instead of deducting 100% of power expense when calculating net taxable income, firms receiving the enhanced deduction incentive may deduct 150%. The labor expense deduction will be 150% of labor expense. 200% of training expenses can be deducted, and so on. These tax perks may be more beneficial than GIE for businesses that incur high power, labor, or training costs. Next slide. Under CREATE, the President may also grant extraordinary incentives for up to 40 years to investments that meet certain conditions. These super investments that we also want to attract are those that provide considerably high levels of jobs, training, technology, and other forms of value added. Altogether, CREATE makes the Philippines' fiscal incentives very generous and at par with packages offered by other countries. Next slide. For businesses currently receiving incentives, CREATE provides a long transition period. For businesses currently enjoying ITH incentive, CREATE will allow them to finish their ITH as scheduled. Existing firms under the 5% GIE incentive will be allowed to enjoy the incentive for 10 more years. This is another very generous compromise on the side of the government and our legislative champions, as the transition period in past versions of the reform were much shorter and dependent on how long the GIE incentive was being enjoyed. Next slide. CREATE also mandates all IPAs to establish a one-stop shop to facilitate the setting up and conduct of projects or activities, including coordination with LGUs and other government agencies, compliant with the Ease of Doing Business Law of 2018. Enterprises may continue to avail of the one-stop shop facility even after expiration of the incentives. This will help ensure that all IPAs perform their role of promoting investment and job creation efficiently and effectively. My presentation ends here. Next slide. And this briefing is by no means exhaustive, so questions will be entertained, and please feel free to raise them in the open forum later. Thank you.
Thank you very much, ma'am, for that very informative talk. As ma'am has stated, we are now opening the floor for questions. You can write your questions in the chat box, or if you want to raise your hands, you may likewise do so that we can call you. Just looking at the chat box, we have a question here from Attorney Amorado, one of our guests. No? Under CREATE, does the application for incorporation of a company which is wholly foreign owned still have to pass through the BOI for recommendation? Ma'am?
The criteria for whether or not, well, all business enterprises which intend to become recipients or beneficiaries of fiscal incentives will have to pass through one of the IPAs. So yes, they would have to pass through BOI if that's the case. If the board of investments is the one that will need to determine this. We're not taking away the previous powers and authorities of the existing investment promotion agencies.
Ma'am, so to clarify, the IPAs still have the approval over all applications where the threshold of investment is below 1 billion pesos.
That's right.
But everything beyond 1 billion pesos, the application has to be direct to the FIRB.
It also passes an IPA because they will have to. It's the IPA which will determine whether or not such an enterprise will qualify for the incentives. It's just that the project for which they're applying the incentive for is beyond the threshold for which final approval will have to be done by the FIRB.
So if it's beyond 1 billion, then it goes through basically two approvals.
Yes.
One with the IPA and one with the FIRB.
Yes, because the FIRB will only handle applications for enterprises which have already been pre-registered by an IPA.
But how about, ma'am, projects that also go to the NEDA? Will that also be affected?
Well, if the project which goes through NEDA will also apply for incentives, then it will go through the same process. It's the same, it's still the same right now, right? because not all projects which go to NEDA for approval go through the IPAs. It's only when they desire to have an incentive or for apply for incentives, which then they need to go to BOI or to PESA, depending on where they want to locate.
Thank you, ma'am. We have a question from past President Rene Limhoco. By how much will these tax reforms cut national government revenue? How does the government plan to recover lost revenue?
The stimulus that will be created by CREATE is estimated to be at 1 trillion pesos in the course of 10 years. So it's about 100 billion, an average of 100 billion every year. It tapers off towards the end of the 10th year, but on the average, it's 100 billion every year. Now, the benefit what we want to happen here is that additional revenues will come in because the Philippines will become more attractive in terms of investments, that there will be more businesses that will venture. So there will be a broader source of revenues other than those that are already registered as businesses in the country today. So there will be more incentives for setting up businesses. So the revenue for GON that we are foreseeing is only from those that are currently existing, from firms that are currently existing, and based on activities that they're doing right now. We have not factored in any improvement in activity or additional investments that will be coming in because of lower income tax rates and a more favorable incentive regime.
Does the government have any estimate of how much investment we are hoping to attract with the reduction of our tax rate?
No, I will not venture to estimate such an amount. Somebody might say I'm too ambitious.
Thank you, ma'am.
Reggie.
Yeah, we have a question from Roland Young.
And okay, Mr. Barcelon is also raising his hand.
We'll go with George first, no? George?
Yeah. No.
Seniority.
Since you asked the questions of ASEC Habitan about foreign investment, I just like to also get her opinion, because we have a pending bill right now in the Legislative Foreign Investment Act.
Yes.
Okay? And that's primarily also crafted so that we will be more attractive to foreign investments. Of course, I think that bill itself is touching on the equity side, okay, on foreign investments. Can you add more to that to enlighten us? Because you have this, as of now, there are many areas that I think for the country, it's favorable. We have the RCEP, Comprehensive Economic Program. And then we have this law that has been passed, the CREATE. And then we have this law that is still being discussed in Congress, the Foreign Investment Act. How do you see the synergy among, these laws?
I think if all the laws, including the Foreign Investments Act, will be legislated and passed into law, it will create the perfect environment for businesses to thrive, for being more attractive to both foreign and domestic investors. So the Foreign Investments Act will open up more areas of business in the country to equity investments from abroad. So that adds more capital into the domestic economy. And the CREATE also allows our domestic enterprises to compete because of the lower income taxes, as well as the enhanced incentives that we are going to have under the law. So I think it's a perfect mix if we can have them all.
May I ask USEC, will there be the exclusion list that we still have? Exclusion list, yung mga
negative list.
Negative list.
Negative. Yes. Sir, for which one?
For will this be tackled in the foreign investment bill?
I'm not sure how the legislation will go. It's really up to Congress how they will craft the language by which these areas will be opened up, which areas of business or investments in the country will be opened up.
Yeah, because it goes hand in hand with the Public Security Act,
Yeah.
which is trying to open up infrastructure sectors,
Mhm.
the telco in many of these sectors, so that citizen would take advantage of a more competitive pricing in the utilities. Thank you, Yusek.
Sir, actually, if that will happen, it's like a second round of economic liberalization. The first round, of course, happened in the early 90s when telecommunications, shipping these industries were also liberalized and opened up to more competition. We're just approaching a second phase if you're allowing more foreign equity into these industries.
I'm sure our members are looking forward to the new Foreign Investment Act when it comes out. We have another question from past President Roland Young. Under CREATE, will the government promote housing by working out a compromise amount for housing exempt from VAT?
What we actually want to happen to housing is to incentivize socialized housing. And one of the reasons, this is actually one of the CREATE law as passed by Congress increased the threshold for the amounts which will be VAT exempt for housing. And that was vetoed by the president. The reason being that by raising the amount from 2.5 million pesos, which was the original amount under train, to 4.2 million pesos, that already ventures into a market which cannot be considered as socialized anymore. So that was vetoed.
Thank you, ma'am. We have a follow-up question from past President Rene Limhoco. Actually, this goes into the registration of SMMEs. No? His premise is that there's a lot of the registered enterprises will be affected by the new tax rate. But how will we encourage more small businesses to actually register their business with the Bureau of Internal Revenue? And will these, aside from these tax changes, so that we can broaden the base of our taxpayers?
Aside from lowering the income tax rates, for me personally, the biggest single incentivizer, if I can invent the word, is to make processes more simple. And this is one way by which BIR, I think, should be improving their tax administration, is to not impose too many requirements for registering, for being a taxpayer on record. So there should be very minimal requirements for you to be registered as a taxpayer. After all, it is always to the benefit of government to have as many taxpayers registered as possible. So why make it difficult for them?
I agree, ma'am. That is a very real thing. Ma'am, how did you react to the vetoes that the president made on the law before he passed it, before he signed it?
We were, it's a president's prerogative to veto certain items. And to be honest about it, some of the veto messages we support, or most of the veto messages that in the veto message of the president we support.
Thank you, ma'am. Any other questions from the floor? Anyone with queries? Yes, George, you have another question. Yes.
You say, Habitan, we're in a very precarious situation. Okay, dire situation, and doesn't look like the economy will be relaxed in the foreseeable months. And definitely, there's a clamoring for more ayudas that's coming from the that has to be distributed to the marginalized. I know the Department of Finance is quite sensitive about government deficit on a certain percentage of our GDP. Unlike other countries, they bite the bullet. They know whatever is needed to really lessen the suffering of the general population. Is there anything in line looking forward that the government will be providing? At one point in time, we had the money being given to the informal sector of the labor through SSS.
Yeah.
And of course, the Labor Department, they have their COVID assistant program, which is known as CAMP.
Yes.
So I'm just wondering, seeing the situation right now, it's not very positive as far as we opening up soon. So I just want to ask, is there anything in the line? Because you are more also involved in the domestic finance. You say, thank you.
Yes, sir. The government there is something in the budget which the cabinet approved for a second round of the social amelioration program. That's what they call the ayuda, the one being distributed through the local government units. So that's in the works right now. That's also for which funding has been sought already, and it's already a program for that help. Certainly, we're in a very tight spot at the moment, and so many questions have been raised about our stance regarding being very careful about how big the deficit should be. And we're constantly compared to other countries, especially here in ASEAN. But I think we also need to remember that unlike our neighbors in ASEAN, the Philippines went through a very painful incident in the 80s when we went through the debt restructuring. I'm not sure if many of you do remember or are old enough to remember the debt restructuring of started in 1983 and went on to 1992. I think we finished the last rescheduling agreements soon after the term of President Aquino ended. But that was quite a harrowing ordeal, and it actually it's something that policymakers, especially the economic managers, do remember very constantly. It's always at the back of our minds that we do not want to go back to such a situation when our interest payments eat up more than 30% of our budget. And certainly, we're not yet close to that. So we're carefully watching our fiscal indicators as well. So it's a pain that is shared. We share it. We know what's happening, and that's why we're trying to keep our fiscal house still in order so that we will be able to still offer some help immediately as soon as we are able to lift all economic restrictions, that we still have the capacity to borrow more for this kind of services in the future, and that the borrowing that we will incur will not be very expensive, because the bigger the deficit, the more loans that we incur in the short term will mean that we might have to pay additional premiums for future loans in the next coming years, and we want to avoid that as much as possible.
Thank you.
Again, any other questions from the floor?
President Reggie,
Yes, yes.
VP Reggie.
Hi, Tito. Yeah, please ask your question.
Madam ASEC,
Sure.
you mentioned our debt service ratio during those difficult times. Would you be able to share with us at what point we are in already vis-a-vis that 70%? Because I think everybody feels that we have already over borrowed, no? And although we still have the capacities, fine, but we're already stretched out. And we might end up in a situation of another restructuring, financial restructuring, no? In the years to come. So for now, what is that ratio that you are looking at today?
Sir, we ended 2020 with a debt to GDP ratio of 54.6% as the national government. That's for the national government. And yes, so and it's a ratio that we're still quite comfortable with. So what we are on the watch out for is that we do not breach that or go over that 54-55 ratio too much in the next coming years. And we want to bring that down as close as possible to where we ended in 2019, which was 39.6%.
And yet, we can understand, of course, you put a cap on it, no? That's fine. That's really prudent financial fiscal management, no? But we're staring at over ₱1 trillion budget deficit for this year. At the end of the day, it's either we don't really fund all of those that have been approved, or again, we resort to more borrowings. No? How do you reconcile this situation?
Sir, we don't do our borrowings in a vacuum. It's a more holistic approach, and our fiscal programming already takes into account our financing program. So the financing program really depends on the deficit target or what's programmed for the national government fiscal deficit. And we also do our fiscal programming not just on an annual basis, but on a rolling 6-year and then 3-year basis. So now we're looking out up to 2024, and we're trying to compute how much debt to GDP or what the debt ratios will be at the end of the time. So as far as the 2021 deficit and financing are concerned, we're quite comfortable that we will be able to fully fund everything that is in the budget. And yes, that means that we will be able to borrow the amount of deficit that is projected in the 2021 budget. And what we are hoping for is that our implementing agencies will also be able to roll out the projects and the activities that are necessary to keep the country going, to provide the services that our citizens require.
Am I
Is
correct?
there a move to... Tito, you have another question? Yeah,
Am I correct that the budget is really approaching higher than $1 trillion, like $1.5 trillion, no? That's a projected deficit you have, no?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but that's but it's something that we are able to have funding for. The financing program is already fully set out to fund the deficit.
Okay, thank you, Madam.
In connection to that, is there a move to actually reduce the bureaucracy? Is the government too big that perhaps we need to reduce it in order for us to be able to be more fiscally sound?
There's always been said that the government is too large. But then when you come to the specific agencies, for example, for the Department of Finance, and the CREATE also establishes an institution called the FILB, for which we need to hire people who will need to be very capable of reviewing 1 billion peso projects. You know, so we need to have that. So we need to hire them. So that needs to be done. In terms of, for example, the public health system, there's always a need for us to hire more doctors, more nurses, more public health workers. And while the plantilla positions are there, they're not always occupied. So in one sense, you can say that, yeah, the government is too huge, we should cut them down. But which part of government are we looking at that we need to cut? Are we talking about the police? Are we talking about the military? Of course, we're not talking about that, because these positions, these agencies are what we call population sensitive. Teachers, for example, certainly we don't want to reduce the number of teachers. So if we really drill down on what kind or which part of the bureaucracy you want to cut, where indeed should we cut? Should we cut the number of departments? But Congress was also very very interested in creating new departments, like a Department of Water, a Department for Disaster Resilience, a separate department for OFWs, for example, which would mean it will fold into one department all the other OFW servicing agencies of government. So it's something that's always bandied about: reduce government, reduce the number of people in government. But when you really sit down and try to establish where do you cut, who do you cut, what positions do you cut, we never really get down to a significant decision about where. And at the end of the day, sometimes the answer is, oh, we need to have more, but in very, very specific areas.
Thank you, ma'am. The naughty brain I have is telling me to cut more people from Congress and the Senate. Any more questions from the floor?
I think Reggie, you're referring to pork barrel.
Reggie?
Yeah.
Jun
Yes,
Palo.
yes.
Yeah.
Hi, June. Yes, please, your question.
I don't know, ma'am, if this is
Hi.
Hi, how are you? Jun Palo.
Hi, architect.
I don't know if this is the right venue. George Marcelon and I were in a meeting at PCCI, and somebody brought up that the undersecretary of DILG for barangays, this community barangay pantries, neighbors.
Community pantry.
Yeah, we're asked to register, and it's these hard times. Neighbors selling extra groceries or food to each other. So if they're required to register to the ILG, will they be taxed? Started in UP Village, now it's happening in the whole country.
You're not my Facebook friend, right? Because I have some choice comments about that in my Facebook comments. But I'm here as an official, so I will not say anything.
I hope you don't tax them.
No, they're not for profit. Nobody's selling, nobody's paying, right?
Yeah, nobody's doing.
Exchanging goods. But
We have a question from Hobart Gonzalez. As per the ASEAN briefing, through the CREATE Act, the Philippine government hopes to increase the country's investment appeal, particularly for business based in China looking to diversify their supply chain in the region. The question is this factual with specific mention to China? If so, what industries and businesses shall China be bringing in?
China. There's many technological industries, new technologies that are based in China. But I think, but some of them are also, I think, investments coming from other countries, like the US, like in Europe. And I believe we're trying to take advantage of the opportunity brought on by the dynamics, the geopolitical dynamics that are happening between US and China, between certain European countries and China, restrictions, and etc. that make moving out of China at this point attractive to their investors. And what we want to happen is if these industries move out of China, that they consider the Philippines as a destination for those migrating companies or migrating industries. Because we have a lot to offer. We have a young population, more or less on the average, very highly educated or very quick to learn. We also have a mastery of English that can still be an asset for any company wishing to establish here.
Thank you, ma'am. Any more questions from the floor? If none, I would like to thank our USEC for answering our questions and to move now to our president for his president's time, for his response rather.
Thank you, PP Reggie. First, let me thank our fellow Rotarian, George Barcelon, our ever reliable, dependable, and venerable member, for making sure we have with us our able speaker to speak to us on this very important legislation, the CREATE Act. Thank you very much, George. Now, for my response, our Speaker Assistant Secretary Maria Teresa Habitan has spoken to us the salient points of the CREATE Act, a 25 years in the making law as mentioned by her, which was enacted into law last March 26 and which took effect last April 11. It is part of corporate fiscal reforms undertaken by our country, which replaced the Corporate Income Tax and Incentive Rationalization Act, or the CITIRA bill, approved by the lower house sometime in September of 2019. But unlike the CITIRA bill, the CREATE Act is a quick response to the urgency of the economic situation in the Philippines arising from the pandemic. In fact, its primary purpose is to accelerate the implementation of the original CITIRA bill in the framework of the Philippines Economic Recovery Plan from COVID-19. In substance, the CREATE Act is a set of corporate and tax reforms to counter the effects of pandemic on our country. It aims to ease the financial burden on foreign and domestic companies through various tax incentives, as well as to grant tax relief for companies in need, and hopes to increase our country's investment appeal to better compete with its ASEAN counterparts. Well, among the salient features of the CREATE Act, as discussed by our speaker, are the reduction of the corporate income tax from the current 30% to 25% for large corporations, including foreign corporations, and 20% for domestic micro, small, and medium enterprises, or those with a taxable income of 5 million and below, and the 7 years of income tax holiday and 10 years of special corporate income tax or enhanced deductions for exporters and key domestic enterprises, which will be identified by the NEDA. These two important features aim to help distressed businesses recover from the COVID-19 pandemic and encourage more investors to bring in capital into the country. As we all know, foreign direct investments are a key source of employment for Filipinos, with more capital often expected to generate more jobs. Now, as a professor and as an avid student of tax law, I can tell you that the reduction of taxes has the nature of a partial or limited tax exemption. It rests upon the theory that such reduction will benefit the people and not upon any idea of lessening the burden of the individual business owners or properties. It supports the presumption that the public interest or benefit that will be subserved is sufficient to offset the monetary loss entailed in the grant of the exemption. In due time, as our speaker earlier mentioned, the incentives given to businesses will propel growth in public spending and eventually improve the economy. Of course, we would have wanted less vetoes made on the original bill, like the proposed increase in the VAT or VAT exempt threshold on the sale of real property to up to 4.2 million VAT exemption, threshold for socialized and low-cost housing, as it would have made it more affordable for those with lower income to afford a house and lot of their own. The proposed 90-day period for the processing of general tax refunds, similar to the provisions in train law, which mandates the processing of VAT refunds in only 90 days, and the automatic approval of applications for incentives if not acted upon within 20 days from submission, as it would have institutionalized trade facilitation as mandated by the Ease of Doing Business and Efficient Government Service Delivery Act of 2018. Yet, despite all these vetoed provisions of the original bill, the CREATE Act is still a good law. It's a big step in addressing the downturn that our economy has suffered for the past 14 months. Our speaker and I have worked together not so long ago when I was still a Deputy Commissioner of the Bureau of Customs under the Department of Finance. I know how ASEC Habitan and her group work at the Department of Finance. It's not an 8-hour job for them. They really work hard to get the numbers correct and properly interpreted for our economic managers. I'm sure ASEC Habitan and her group are once again spending long hours reviewing the drafts of the implementing rules and regulations of the CREATE Act prepared by the BIR, which is targeted to be rolled out next month, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah.
So thank you for your untiring public service, ASEC Maria Teresa Habitan. On behalf of the Rotary Club of Makati, our lovely aunts, our district governor, Chacha Camacho, the other Rotarians from different Rotary clubs in our district, especially to my classmates, the Perfect Vision presidents, our Rotaractors, my students in Tax Law 1 at the Universidad de Manila, my fellow law professors of the Pamantasan ng Lungsod ng Maynila, my most law family, and all the other guests in attendance. Please accept our heartfelt gratitude for taking time and sharing with us your very valuable insights on the CREATE Act. And as tokens of our appreciation for your time in service, we shall be giving you a copy of our 50th anniversary coffee table book, which contains our club's 50 years of community service and fellowship, together with a bottle of red wine for you to enjoy while going through the pages of our book. So again, once again, thank you very much, ASEC Habitan.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr.
Ate.
President, as always, for your wonderful response. Now we'd like to ask everyone, please turn
ASEC,
on your videos.
maraming salamat po. Thank you.
Salamat din po.
Salamat,
Thank you.
salamat.
Thank you.
Thank you,
And
Asa.
please turn on your videos, everyone, for our usual photo with
Yeah,
our
thank you.
speaker. Ron, please take over.
Okay. 1, 2. Next window. 1, 2. Last window. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, everyone, and have a safe day.
Thank you.